assume that the webcast will be starting. Give them a minute, and he knew I would wave, so okay. So anyway, welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar. My name is Jennifer Dill. I'm a faculty member in Urban Studies and Planning and also director of OTREC, the Oregon Transportation Research and Education Consortium. And I'm very happy today to have our first OTREC visiting scholar of the year here visiting us, Professor Eric Dumbaugh from the Texas A&M University. He is in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning there. And he's out visiting with us for a couple days as a guest of OTREC. He got his PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering at Georgia Tech a few years ago and has been teaching at Texas A&M and been doing some very interesting research that he's going to talk about today on safety. And just a couple reminders to everyone to, at the end, hold your questions till the end of the seminar and to remember to use the microphones in front of you. Hold the touch button, keep the red light lit while you ask questions so that all of the people watching on the web can hear your question. If there is no microphone nearby, one of us will walk around and give you this one to use. So without further ado, I'll turn it over. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you for the turnout. This is very exciting. It's actually my second day here. Yesterday I was at Metro and talked to folks about safety there. And the focus yesterday was on street design. Today I want to talk about something a little different. I want to talk about the role of community design on crash incidents, because it's something that the planning community in the urban design community was very, very interested in at the turn of the century. And a lot of the communities we have today, we have in their current form because of our attempts to address traffic safety. And we've forgotten how to design safe communities. So this talk is to reassess how we design communities to address the issue of traffic safety. Now, to understand traffic safety and why our communities look the way they do, we need to actually go back to the turn of the century. And at the beginning of the 20th century, the predominant form of community development was the urban grid. Now, we like this today because it's good for pedestrians. If we time the signals and intersections right, it's good for transit. And we try to promote this. But that wasn't why we designed cities this way at the turn of the century. We did it because it was easy and it was good for economic development. The premium lots in any city were the corner lots. So if you wanted to maximize economic development, what you did is you maximized the number of corners, right? So cities typically would just plot themselves out, follow the existing street grid ad infinitum to encourage future development. Now, this created a problem once we started adopting automobiles. And the problem was that these streets that were so good for promoting access and development were also good for automobile traffic. And the concern was that the urban grid was allowing this traffic, right, this mobility-oriented traffic to diffuse through residential areas and through neighborhoods, and it was creating a major problem. And it wasn't also designed very well to move traffic at very high speeds. Each one of those intersections was a conflict point, created friction with other road users that slowed traffic down. So you had early planners and urban designers, and none less than Frederick Law Olmsted, complaining about this as a development form. And as he said, it's been the tendency of street planners, whether acting for the city or for landowners, to give inadequate attention to the need of the public for main thoroughfares laid out with sole regard to the problems of transportation. Stated another way, our problem was we weren't really thinking about transportation systems at all when we designed this. Right? It was something done for economic development purposes and not for addressing traffic. Now, he proposed an alternative, and that was what his father had done at Central Park. Now, one of the major design problems with building a park of this magnitude is how you get cross-traffic, trying to travel across the park, to get across the park without undermining the purpose of the park itself, which was to provide a pastoral recreational amenity for the residents of New York. There was going to be a lot of cross-park traffic. The question then was how to accommodate this in a form that allowed that park to maintain its pastoral form. Well, the solution was to do transverse roads. Has any of you been to New York or Central Park? Some of you have had. So you may be familiar with these. They run below grade. The solution was, and you can see it running along the top, let's put in a grade-separated road that's relatively direct across the park that will prevent people from actually going across the surface of the park. Let's get this through-moving traffic separated away from the recreational traffic at the top of the park. And one of the nice things about the early Olmsted plans is he actually wanted to show you what he was trying to avoid. And it was all this riffraff, right? the little orphan waifs and the dung carts and the fire trucks, this stuff you don't want to see on the surface. And it's nice that he did this. He drew this riffraff, right, running through the transverse roads. That's what he was trying to design for. Now, today it handles a completely different type of riffraff, right? So today, these are the major conduits, traffic conduits, through the park. And if you've tried to travel across New York, not that you should have any good reason to drive there, but if you did, you'd likely have used one of these roads. So that's what the intention was from Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And this was carried forward into some of the early design guidebooks for city planning. In this case, this was edited by John Nolan, 1916 City Planning. What was argued is that rather than doing street grids, what we need to do is we need to start bringing in a differentiation between the main thoroughfares, these major traffic conduits, and secondary ones which are intended for local or recreational use. Let's take the design lesson of Central Park, where there are different thoroughfare types for different transportation purposes, and apply that to the design of our communities, with the two principal types of roadways being major traffic roadways and local roadways. And this is where we get the functional classification system. And we blame engineers for this. This was an urban design solution, right? The same mindset flows into, and this is the classic functional classification graphic. We go from arterials, which are designed principally for mobility, with little access-related traffic, to locals that are intended exclusively for access with little or no mobility. That's where this idea comes from. Now, it was carried forward into design practice by folks like Clarence Perry. Now, many of you may be familiar with his neighborhood unit concept. I know a lot of the new urbanist groups, they'll present this, and in many cases they'll present this as a model of what ought to be done. And it's not a terrible design, but it's important to recognize what this is. This is not a traditional community. This is a community intended to expressly solve specific traffic problems. What's going on here is we've got a neighborhood bounded by major arterial streets. And they do that, and it's designed this way to address the issue of street safety. And the intention is to create high-speed through arteries around the community to prevent traffic from penetrating the interior of the community. Now, this is the same idea Olmsted was suggesting, translated into a further form. But what Clarence Perry did over and above this was he changed the land use configurations too. So rather than just changing the way we design streets, let's also reorient land uses to reinforce the separation of traffic functions. Now, community-oriented use, community centers, parks, and schools and churches, things that don't generate a lot of external traffic, the recommendation is to internalize them. But the neighborhood shopping, the retail, the commercial, get those outside of the community itself. And what you're seeing is that these are pushed out onto the arterials and specifically onto the intersections of arterials. Now, if there was any confusion about what he was proposing here, he showed us. And housing for the machine age. The optimal retail solution for these communities is one like this one that's located at the intersection of two arterials and designed to accommodate the parking that would be generated by the pass-by traffic on those. And his assertion, it's one of the advantages of the neighborhood unit scheme that it makes good business locations definite and easily found. Put them on the major traffic junctions. That's where that traffic wants to be. That's where it wants to access. Neighborhood folks traveling to and from their neighborhood from work can access these things, and you can capture pass-by trips off the arterials. It's win-win, right? It's a good solution. And it's what we have today. I mean, the model here from the 1930s is the model we still employ, albeit in a modified form, in the 21st century. And it reached its archetypal form in Radburn. Right? Radburn took this idea and extended it even further. The key innovation here was the residential cul-de-sac. And what we see in Radburn, again, is major arterials bounding a community. The retail use is pushed out of the neighborhood and onto these arterials. And then, to make sure that nobody cuts through the residential streets, we'll put them on cul-de-sacs so that they don't connect anywhere. And the idea behind this, and this is often overlooked, but it was expressly a traffic safety solution, right? Because the gridiron pattern is as obsolete as a fortified town wall. Every year, there are more injuries and deaths associated with automobile accidents than the total American war casualties in any year, and it was the answer to these conditions that the Radburn Plan was formed. Let's take this traffic, push it out of the community, put it onto these arterials, and we will address urban traffic safety problems. Now, the question then becomes with this, what was the empirical base on which these assertions were made? Well, there was one study, up until recently, there was only one study that really looked at this, and it was a 1957 study by Harold Marks. And what he did is he looked at gridiron residential neighborhoods and he called them limited access subdivisions, disconnected subdivisions, to see which were safer. And limited access ones, the disconnected ones, had fewer crashes and injuries. Well, he just looked at crashes, had fewer crashes than the gridiron ones. But there are a couple problems with this study. Oh, and intersection type matters too. You have fewer crashes on 3-leg intersections than you did on 4-leg intersections, regardless of community type. 3-leg intersections were safer. But one of the major problems is the study didn't account for vehicle miles traveled. One of the major complaints with the grid was that it allowed traffic to diffuse through a neighborhood's boundaries. And as a result, inside these neighborhoods, you're going to have higher levels of VMT. So you're going to have higher levels of exposure. And it wasn't accounted for in the study. The other thing, and what I would assert to you in a moment is more problematic, is it didn't account for the effect of displacing traffic away from the residential areas itself. If you have a disconnected subdivision, the only traffic in that area is going to be the local traffic itself. So you may have fewer traffic within its boundaries, but it may be accomplished only by displacing those crashes elsewhere, or even increasing the amount of crashes that would otherwise have occurred. I mean, by the same thinking, if you want the absolute safest street for motor vehicles, what you do is you close off all motor vehicle traffic, right? Problem solved. Right? You don't see a lot of pedestrian crashes. So the guiding safety ideas that are driving this form is that, one, we need to design roadways for a specific traffic function. And the current project to supplement the functional classification system is an objection to that safety principle. The second is that the street network ought to be redesigned to eliminate cut-through traffic. And then finally, we ought to relocate traffic-generating uses onto arterial roadways. Now, there's one more element of this that needs to be considered. Why do we design these roadways to be so fast? Right? Arterials are intended to carry high volumes of traffic, but we also carry them at high speeds. Well, this started because we separated out the design of these roadways from the planning and urban design groups to traffic engineers. And it started in 1916. A major concern we had in the United States was, how do we develop a highway system that can help carry freight goods across country? On dirt roadways, this is very problematic. Here, your roadways are always muddy, right? So it's always a nightmare. Texas, it rains during one part of the year. They get all boggy, and then it gets real hard, and it becomes very rough to travel. The concern was, how do we get the farmers out of the mud? Right? We've got to get this freight good to market. We created state bureaus of public roads to address this issue. Right? In the United States, what we do is we delegate these functions down to the states. So each state, in order to spend federal funds to pave roadways, had to create a Bureau of Public Roads tasked with that, which later became our Departments of Transportation. And they were tasked with getting the farmers out of the mud. And what they did is they adopted these major trade routes onto state highway systems with the express purpose of carrying higher speed, long-distance traffic. And then in 1932, we gave them an ongoing revenue source to engage in this function. Right? And this is when we got the beginnings of our gas tax. So we've now got an agency that's devoted to high-speed through-moving traffic and has funding to create that. And unsurprisingly, you've now got agencies who view their function as high-speed through-moving traffic. Right? That's how we got these. But that is not entirely where we got the speed issue. If you go to the earliest edition of the Green Book, right, it came out in 1940, there was an express concern about the use of wider design features. We widen out roadways to get people to go faster. You may invite higher speeds. And there was a concern about that, specifically in urban areas. This changed in the 1960s, the way we address safety on these roadways. And it changed as a result of the publication of Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed. It's best known now for the repeal of the Corvair and the hazards of that car, but it was promoting a specific philosophical or theoretical idea on safety. And this idea was that we have an epidemic on the highways. Epidemiology is concerned with eliminating environmental sources of hazards, with the founder of that being John Snow. The concern in England was that there was an epidemic of cholera, and the question was, how do we get people from drinking out of contaminated wells? Rather than educating them not to drink out of a contaminated well, John Snow just pulled the handle off the pump of the well, which is now in a tavern right behind where it stood. Right? And by doing that, it was a very simple and effective solution. It kept people from drinking that water. Well, what Nader was arguing was that we ought to apply the same kind of principle to traffic safety. Right? Rather than trying to tell people how to behave safely, let's just assume they're idiots. Right? And let's design them under the expectation that they behave like fools. Right? So we'll assume they engage in bad behavior, and we'll design it to eliminate the consequences of that. And this resulted in a public outcry to address the design dangers of our roadways, which then triggered the 1966 joint U.S. Senate National Highway Safety hearings. Now, at the time, we didn't have systematic recording of traffic data, but folks did the best they could. And they found that interstate highways, though designed for speed, reported fewer crashes than other highway types. And this was a really novel finding. It wasn't something that we would have expected to have found. The wider lanes was to allow people to travel faster. The shoulders were to allow people to break down. Right? So if they break down, get them out of the throughways. This wasn't intended for safety. That it was safer was a eureka moment. Why is this? Well, it must be addressing these designed dangers in an effective way. And it makes sense from an engineering perspective, right? We've got extra room, extra latitude, right? If there's a wider lane and a driver makes a mistake, there's more room to correct. If a driver runs off the roadway, that clear offset and that paved shoulder gives them more room to correct. That must be why it's safer. So we concluded that these were safer for those reasons, that they were forgiving to error. And this is why we have the idea that high design values, high design speeds result in safer roadways. The testimony at the time, the kind of testimony you would see were things like, what we've got to do is convert the 90% or more of our surface streets to freeway conditions, right? Let's take our local streets and our collector streets and our arterial streets and apply freeway conditions to those, right? If it's good for freeways, it's got to be good for urban surface streets, right? One size fits all. And Kenneth A. Stonex, by the way, is one of the leaders in traffic safety in the profession. And if you get a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Transportation Research Board for traffic safety, it's an award named after Kenneth Stonex, right? That's the man. But it's a concept that engineers, and I say this as one trained in engineering, we can relate to, right? Because we learn about things like design failure, right? So if the Brooklyn Bridge has a design load of 20,000 tons, it can accommodate 10,000 tons, right? We've doubled that margin of safety. Applying the same mindset, if we want to double the margin of safety for people traveling at 30 miles an hour, you design for 60, right? Because if it's safe for 60, it's got to be safe for 30. That's the idea. And we see that in the design guidelines that have come forth since. Highways built with high design standards put the travel in an environment that's fundamentally safer because it's going to compensate for the errors he, or not to be sexist, she will eventually make. Right? And in the more current edition of the Green Book, every effort should be made to use as high design speed as practical to attain a desired degree of safety. So what we now have are the 3 urban design principles plus the third one added by engineering, which is these through-moving high-speed facilities ought to be designed for really, really high speeds. Right? Make them super fast. So the question I had, and this, what I'm about to show you comes from an article that came out in the Journal of the American Planning Association over the summer, was, does this urban form result in safer communities? I didn't think we'd done a particularly good job of examining it before. So what I did, and with a co-author, Robert Ray, what we did is we looked at crashes in the San Antonio region. Now, San Antonio was selected because it's, even though Texas, we get a bad rap for having terrible cities, we actually do have some nice places. And a lot of them are in San Antonio. So downtown San Antonio, the King William District up at the top being some examples of pretty good urbanism. But of course, it's Texas, so we have our sprawl, we have our rural stuff. We've got a high range of design variation here. That's not solely why I selected San Antonio, though. San Antonio was also handy because most of the region, 90% of the 1.4 million people there live in the city, which means you can get data in a reliable form from one source, and that's the San Antonio Police Department. And it prevented me from having to monkey around with all these other jurisdictions that may have different data collection procedures. So what it enabled me to do was get reliable data from a single source. And what we did is we took the data for San Antonio, we integrated it with parcel-level land use data and street data so that we could then look at both what the land use characteristics are, what the street and street network characteristics are, as well as the distribution of crashes environmentally through the region. And to operationalize it, the question then becomes, well, what do we use as a neighborhood? And one of the things we wanted to look at was the effect of demographics on crash incidents. So we took census block groups, not the ideal definition of how you would define a community, but from a data standpoint about the best we could do. We took block groups, captured the census information that were in there, then aggregated the crashes and land use conditions up to the block group level. The variables we used, and I'll tick off these quickly because I know this is the kind of stuff that's pretty tedious, right? We academics love to go on this stuff, and it really bores an audience. I'll hit this quickly, and then I'll get to the fun stuff. But it's important to tell you what we did. We controlled for block group acreage, vehicle miles traveled, median household income, The presence of particular at-risk populations, so were there elderly folks there over 75, were there young adults. But the urban form variables we wanted to look at, what were the effects of density on crash incidents? We saw that 3- and 4-leg intersections had different safety effects, so we brought that information in as well and figured out what the presence of those intersections within a community would be. We looked at the total mileage of arterials, total mileages of freeways, and then the land uses. How many arterial-oriented commercial uses were there? How many big box stores were there in a community? And then how many neighborhood-scaled uses were there? And we examined 3 dependent variables: total crashes, injurious crashes, and fatal crashes. And the reason for this is that the factors that influence different crash types may be different. So you may have a strategy that's effective for reducing total crashes, but if all of those crashes are fatal, it's hard to argue that it's a safer environment. So what we wanted to look at was whether or not different environments or different conditions affected the different crash types. Skip these real quick because you don't care. Right?
Hey, we're geeks here.
Huh?
Assume we don't care.
Okay. The ones you guys are going to want to know, and I'll hit these. VMT is what you think. It's the sum of the vehicle miles traveled within a community. Density is the number. We use population rather than housing units because people drive, housing units don't drive. So populations per net residential acre. The urban form stuff, this you'll want to know because it's important. We operationalize strip commercial as being very simply whether or not an arterial was located adjacent to, or commercial use was located adjacent to an arterial. Big box was whether or not one of the retail or commercial uses had more than 50,000 square feet, but a floor area ratio of 0.4 or less. Stated another way, there's a lot of lot in a little building, right, because it's got a big parking lot. And then neighborhood retail was a neighborhood or commercial use that occupied 20,000 square feet or less, but had an FAR of 1 or greater. Or to state it another way, the building envelope was as large as the parcel itself, which could mean it encompassed the entire parcel, or if it's 2 stories, half of it, right? It's a higher level of urbanism. So it's also not just a proxy for neighborhood retail, but it's also a proxy for whether or not it's an urban environment. The models used, this is the stuff that really bores you, and I'm going to show this in a better form in a minute. But this is up here for the interest of disclosure, right? The model results, we use negative binomial regression models. It's the right model for using over-dispersed count data. I'm waiting to see you yawn. That's what we used. The results are easier to show another way. We could tick off each of those coefficients and you'd be bored. Here's what we found. For the control variables, we found what you would expect. Median income had no effect on total crash incidents, but it was associated with fewer injury and fatal crashes, and you would expect that. Wealthier people have newer cars invariably are more crash-worthy. So areas with more wealthy people had fewer injurious and fatal crashes, but their likelihood of being involved in a crash was the same. Older adults, the presence of older adults was associated with more total crashes, but had no effect on injurious or fatal crashes. So more fender benders there. And again, one thing we know of older adults is they compensate for declining abilities by reducing their speed, which will reduce severity. That's a theory, and at this aggregate level, I don't know that that's necessarily correct, but it's the best interpretation. But in either event, it's controlling for that element. Younger adults have the same factor you would expect, associated with increases in all crash types, significant for total and injurious, not more significant, or positive but not significant for fatals. And part of the reason for that is simply that the count of fatals was probably too low to register as significant. But the relationship, the association was positive. VMT was associated with an increase in crashes as well, as you would expect. Now the good stuff, the urban form stuff. To understand the results, it's important to understand that the design conditions that we exist in today are not the design conditions at the turn of the century. Your Model T could go about 35 miles an hour. Right? That was about the maximum speed. And with pavement conditions in the 1920s and 1930s, it wasn't getting anywhere near that much. So when you design things for wider lanes and shoulders, you're not going to see an increase in speed because the vehicles can't do it. That is very different than the condition we have today, where the only controlling constraint on speed is the roadway's geometry itself. Vehicles can easily go in excess of 100 miles an hour. And the thing determining that is either whether or not the driver is too scared or afraid of being penalized for doing so, or whether the geometry prevents them from doing that. So when we do what we currently do, we widen out these roadway for high speeds, what we wind up seeing is, unsurprisingly, higher speeds, right? People get on these roadways, it allows them to travel at higher speeds, and they do travel at higher speeds. And this creates the safety problem. And I can show this in Portland. Now, the idea here with this was to enhance sight distance, with the objective being that people who can see longer distance are better prepared to respond and react to a hazard that enters the travelway. That was the idea. But what happens is people adjust their speed upwards. And this creates the problem of stopping sight distance. The faster you're going, the longer it's going to take you to bring your vehicle to a stop. And to illustrate different speeds and different stopping sight distances, I put this over top of Pioneer Square. You guys would be familiar with this, right? You guys have been here before. It's like 3 blocks away. Yeah. All right. So let's presume, what avenue is this, 6th? Broadway. Let's say you're at Broadway and you see a hazard crash or a hazard end of the travelway. How far will you travel before you can bring it to a break? Well, at 20 miles an hour, you can stop within 100 feet or by mid-block. And that's pretty good. Increase that speed to 40, and you're getting through that next intersection before you can bring the vehicle to a stop. And bring it up to 60, right, which is what we often design our arterials for. You're going through that first intersection, you're getting ready to enter the second, right? So what happens is you need to be able, anything that crosses needs to cross beyond that location for you to be able to avoid that crash. Now, we know nobody drives 60 miles an hour. Well, hopefully not on Broadway. You would expect not. But the point is to illustrate the scale or the distance that gets traveled. Now, it doesn't happen on Broadway, but it happens on our arterials all the time, right? That functionally serve the same developmental purpose, right? Just as downtown serves a lot of commercial and retail, we provide all of this, we line our arterials with all of this, and we get the same type of urban traffic. People trying to cross the street, right? Except now people are going faster in the through lanes, so it takes longer time to brake. So you've got kids running out on their skateboards, you've got a potential problem. But it's not just pedestrians. Motorists turn in and out of those driveways, and the same safety problem applies. Somebody cuts out of that driveway, they're apt to get rear-ended. People try to turn left. They get T-boned, right? These types of crashes begin occurring in this environment, and the people going through the through lanes aren't prepared to respond to those conditions. And the issue that I want to raise is the issue of systematic design error. Now, in engineering, we try to address random error, or the result that happens for people behaving like fools. And people do drive like fools, and we ought to address that. But we're also creating conditions that lead to error. And not only don't we address that, we don't even look at it. We don't pay attention to it in design. Right now, we've got a mismatch between the way a designer intends a roadway to be used and the way it's actually used. On our surface arterials, we design them intentionally for high speeds. But they're used for low-speed access-related functions, and that creates the safety problem. And the types of crashes you see, rear-end angle, pedestrian, and roadside, I talked about that yesterday. I won't get into that today. Roadside crashes occur as well. Now, when you look at the model results, you see this borne out, right? Each additional mile of arterial thoroughfare within a community is associated with a 15% increase in total crashes, a 17% increase in injurious crashes, and a 20% increase in fatals. You want to drive up your crash count? Add arterials. That's the solution to your problem, right? Arterial-oriented commercial uses. These are the ones that generate that traffic, right? They're the ones that need driveways that vehicles turn in and out of. What do we see? Each additional one adds a 1.3% increase in total crashes and a 1.1% increase in injuries. And they're agglomerative. So to drive up that number, just add more. Big box stores. Let's magnify the problem more. We've got higher traffic volumes associated with big box stores, and as a result, we see a greater magnitude of effect in terms of affecting crash incidents. 6.6% increase in total crashes, 4% increase in injurious crashes. But here's one thing that's cool about this study, well, that's interesting about this study that I would call your attention to, which is these crashes don't necessarily occur just on the streets, because your big box stores have internal access lanes too. And those are prime locations for people to get into crashes. And they do. In the case of San Antonio, we looked at this, and 16.4% of the fatals were in off-network locations, right? Driveways, parking lots, alleys are counted in that too. About 10% of the injurious and about 13% of the total were on off-network locations, or they were not on a public street. Our conventional form of safety analysis, we don't even look at those, right? If you're a state DOT, you look at what happened on the state highway system, and if it happened off the state highway system, it ain't your problem, okay? But I would suggest to you that this may well be a huge safety problem that we don't address right now at all. And the point I want to make with this is that a lot of our land use decisions are creating safety problems. Because we take a road network like this one, and you can see where the arterials are, they're the bright yellow roadways, and our land use planner comes along, and they superimpose commercial uses on top of that as part of local developmental policy. And as soon as you put this, the arterials themselves are fine if they remain limited access. But when you put the access on them, that's the combination that puts the bullet in the chamber. That's the problem. Now our conventional response, we can see here, this is actually Georgia. Right, we've got a lot of access, we post a sign, right? We say go 35. Problem is drivers ignore them. People don't pay attention to these signs because they don't tell them anything useful. When police aren't present, up to 75% of drivers in urban areas ignore posted speed limits. They read the road. And interestingly, studies that have tasked drivers with paying attention to the information presented on signs, they don't cognitively register them. They get so used to ignoring signs, or they get so focused on ignoring other things that are more important, like is somebody going to pull out in front of me or what are the road conditions, that they overlook the signs entirely, even when they're tasked with doing so. And to reiterate this point, this was a cool study done in Spain, and it wanted to see if you could get drivers to drive a speed limit under the design speed. So they had drivers and tasked them with going 20 miles an hour under the design speed of a roadway, or kilometers, it's Europe. Under the design speed, and they found that drivers could do that. But they did that by continually looking down at their speedometer. And I would suggest to you that where you want drivers looking is not at the speedometer, you want them looking at the road. Right? But that in and of itself is not an interesting finding. We can do that. What's interesting here is then to see if people would do that under distracted conditions, they had a passenger sit in the car and talk to them. Right? And what we see here, the light gray is when the drivers are just driving and tasked with doing that, and you see the speed shift up every time the driver's asked a question or they're engaged in a thought process. Right? So what happens is drivers, rightfully, you have a limited amount of executive level cognitive function. So you orient that towards the task at hand and you automate the other part of the task. So what you do is you wind up shifting off to what the safe speed of the road feels like because your attention's focused elsewhere. And I would suggest to you that under the normal driving condition, even when we're not on the phone, we're not staring at the speedometer. We're listening to the radio, right? We're thinking about what happened during work today. And the result is, and the point is that you're going to see drivers shift up to what the perceived safe speed of the roadway is, regardless of the speed limit you put there. That's what we're naturally inclined to do. It's rational behavior. What happens if you change the developmental form of a community? What was interesting, neighborhood-scaled commercial uses were associated with fewer crashes. A 2.2% decrease in total crashes for each neighborhood-scaled retail use in a community, and a 3.3% decrease in injurious crashes. Stated another way, as places became increasingly urban, you saw a significant reduction in the incidence of total and fatal crash, or total and injurious crashes. And this is in other work, I've seen this before. I looked at whether or not these livable streets were safer than our conventionally designed arterial roadways. And they were. Per vehicle mile traveled, livable streets, and this was done in Central Florida, had 40% fewer mid-block crashes than roadways on a whole, and 100% fewer fatalities. Those traffic fatalities weren't occurring on your main streets or your pedestrian-oriented streets. Your problem is the arterials. Actually, and these roadways were all designated as state arterials. The difference was, zero fatalities in the livable side. I had about 2 miles worth of them in there, and I had about 25 miles of total roadway. None of the fatalities happened there. And there was one segment of roadway that I thought was really interesting. I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but it's worth bringing up again today. This is Woodland Boulevard in Deland, Florida. It's a big road, 14-foot lanes, right? Plenty of room. Double line of street trees. It's a 4-foot setback from the street tree to the edge of curb, but 14-foot lanes. No traffic control along its length. The only thing governing a driver's selection of speed is the speed at which they feel they can safely go. And so I did a floating car study through there. And the speed I found them going, the typical speed was about 29 miles an hour. Right? People approached on an arterial where they were going 40, 45, and they decelerated on the approach and traveled through. And the safety performance of this roadway reflects that speed behavior. These trees, despite having 2 rows of roadside trees, there weren't any roadside crashes that occurred. Drivers responded to that environment by adjusting their behavior to operate in a safe manner through there. There were 4 injurious mid-block crashes, and these were all associated with people trying to turn in and out of driveways, and no fatalities. It's a safe road. And it's safe because drivers respond to the design environment by modifying their behavior. Now, other urban form variables that may matter. Population density. Each additional person per net residential acre resulted in a teeny tiny reduction in crashes. But it was significant, right? And you wouldn't expect each additional person to have a huge effect, but it had a little effect. So higher densities in general were associated with fewer crashes. But I would suggest to you that density is probably going to be more important for its moderating effects rather than just in and of itself, right? Because at higher densities, you generate less VMT. You also have higher demand for creating urbanized land uses, which are also safer. And you see this in other studies. And actually, I was talking to a fellow from the city here, and you're seeing this in the city here as well. Once you reach a critical mass of road users, people adjust their behavior, and you see places become less safe. Or in this case, you see fewer crashes. This was a study by Peter Jacobson a few years back, and it confirms what you're seeing here in Portland, right, with the agglomeration of bicyclists. As you reach a critical mass of people walking or biking, you see crashes involving these users decline precipitously. Safety in numbers is the name of the article, and it's the same idea. Density will get you that critical mass that will allow you to get that safety in numbers. Now, here's one urbanists aren't going to like, right? But in the interest of disclosure, what about intersections? Well, intersections will reduce speeds, and they'll reduce fatals because lower speed reduces the severity of crashes. But 4-leg intersections are problematic. The early designers were right that they're a problem. You're going to have an increase, significant, I found, in both total and injurious crashes with an increase in the number of 4-leg intersections within a community. And that is unsurprising because intersections are where your major traffic conflicts occur. Divergent streams of traffic have to cross one another, and it creates opportunities for crashes, and it increases crashes. 3-leg intersections were a little better. And part of the reason is because 3-leg intersections force at least one stream of traffic to stop and yield. So the safety effects for 3-way was actually okay. No effect on total and injurious, and a reduction in fatals. Your 4-leg intersections, however, were the problem. So what this suggests is not, as many people advocate, that we should do a wholesale return to the urban grid. There was a reason why early designers were concerned with this, and their concerns were well-founded. It does suggest, however, that hybrid street networks, right, that introduce a lot of 3-leg intersections into a community might be advantageous from the perspective of safety. They're good because they result in termini that prevent vehicles from collecting a good head of steam, and they force one leg of that to yield. And truthfully, a lot of the new projects that are coming in aren't really traditional grids. They're hybrid networks that provide a lot of T intersections and a lot of street termini. But I'm not sure at the level that I looked at this that it would be fair to say that all 4-leg intersections are bad. There are ways to address safety at 4-leg intersections. We've seen this with roundabouts and traffic circles. You put those in, you reduce the number of conflict points, and you'll have a substantial reduction in crashes and injuries that occur. What we're also seeing is psychological traffic calming be put in place. In Europe, this is Mackinghau. This is in the Netherlands. No traffic control whatsoever. It's actually a T intersection, but you've got 2 of them clustered together. But what we find is that the environment suggests to the driver that a specific type of behavior is warranted, and the result is that you have an elimination of crashes and injuries. People get in this environment, they're not really sure what to do. They can't go very fast, so they yield. And it's cool. And I hear in Texas, I'll see people get this, and they get this half-baked idea that we ought to take 2 arterials and pull the signals out of it and take all the paint off. That's a horrible idea, right? Well, why it works here, and Hans Monerman, who died recently, his take was if you want people to drive like they're in a village, you design a village, right? Because people will respond to the environmental context in which you place them. Finally, what about urban freeways? I know it's a major project for a lot of folks to tear their freeways out. And you guys in Portland are ahead of the curve, right? You already tore your freeway out. You know, I went jogging on Nato Parkway last night, right? You guys solved that problem years ago. Well, don't tear them out for safety's sake. They're not related to the increased incidence of total and injurious crashes. And they're associated with a slight but insignificant increase in fatals. And that's not unsurprising because the speeds at which crashes occur are going to result in a serious injury or a death. But On the whole, they're not bad roadways, at least from a safety perspective, because they address the fundamental safety problem we have in cities, which is the combination of speed and access. And they solve the problem by getting rid of all the access. Pull the access off that roadway, and it's fine. And the principal effect of these is to let people drive faster. Now, what is the useful take-home? Because you guys are professionals, you guys are students, you guys that are going to be professionals, right? And you don't want a lot of academic rigmarole, right? You don't care about coefficients, you care about things that you can use. So let me try to bring 3 principles here that can be taken from this. First, it suggests that when we design communities, we need to manage the mobility and access functions of urban arterials. It's not sufficient to say that a roadway is an arterial, therefore it's a roadway for mobility. Because when you put the land use on there for being retail or commercial, you've created an access-related road, no matter what you call it. You know, a rose by any other name, and it's hardly a rose. What you need to do is orient those retail and commercial uses towards the lower speed thoroughfares. If there's access, the speed needs to be accommodating to that access. And there are a number of ways to do that that I'm going to show you in a second. And then finally, we need to start planning our land use, speed management, and access control at the level of the network rather than just the street. It's not enough to say this street is a low-speed street. We need to have a network that reinforces that function and that manages speed. If people are going to divert off of one route onto another, what speed are they going to do that? We need to pay attention to that because there's redistributive effects associated with changing your network characteristics. Now, one solution, that's an effective solution for urban areas, and if those of you do, I know a lot of people yesterday do this transect stuff. So if you do, I've transect coded these for you. So one solution might be to do what we do on freeways, address safety through design by emphasizing mobility over access. Eliminate that entirely. Now, this isn't an urban street, right? This is a street that belongs on the periphery of a developed area. It provides no direct land use access. An alternative that works is access management. Florida's done a lot of work with this. In fact, Florida has put out some of the guidebooks that direct how we ought to do this. Access management is great because it attempts to do on surface streets the same thing we do on freeways. It eliminates the access function from a mobility-oriented road. It does that by putting in a median that prevents turning maneuvers and ideally eliminating those access-related uses entirely from the roadway. So you don't have a lot of that cross-traffic access that creates crashes. And we see this is from a TRB report up there. You can see the reduction in crashes associated with different design treatments. However, and T3, this is a suburban solution. I want to make that clear. I hear a lot of folks say we ought to do access management in our cities. And true access management is a suburban and not an urban solution. Because an access-managed design roadway is not a pedestrian-friendly median-type roadway. Ideally, access management should be done with wide spacing between signalized intersections to allow good progression of traffic. It's still designed for these high speeds. And the median is not your pedestrian-friendly median. It's one that channelizes traffic into locations that you want. And you need to be sensitive to this. Now, you can certainly stage the design of a median over time so that it can transform from one to the other, but strict access management is not an especially urban solution. Your urban solution are your livable streets. They're lower speed streets that are designed to accommodate access. Buildings are brought up to the street to reinforce the fact that this is an access street. And the result of that is a reduction in speed and greater preparedness on the part of the driver to address things like crossing pedestrians and drivers pulling in and out of driveways. And this intersection here, by the way, it's relatively safe. It's a 5-leg intersection, which most of us engineers would gasp at. It's not just a 4, but it's got one coming out at an angle. But it's relatively safe. Over the time period we looked at, I think there were 2 or 3 crashes, no injuries and no fatalities there. Now, what do? You're in the suburbs. You're stuck with these arterials. Developers want to build on them, right? That's their natural location. The ideal situation for new development is at the intersection of 2 high-volume arterials. How do you do that in a way that's safe? And how do you do that in a way that you can transition from a suburban to an urban context? Well, we've gotten pretty good at this, actually, and developers are leading the way on this one. It is, Florida, we call them lifestyle centers. You guys have those out here? No? You.
Oh, Bridgeport.
Yeah, this is trying to take the best of the access management stuff and the best of the livable street stuff. Now, they're not doing it for that because they don't care about crashes, right? They care about money, right? And in Florida, we realize if you create a civic realm, you make more money. So you've got developers trying to create a civic realm. so they can make more money. We've got here the intersection of two major highways, but what they've done is they've channelized all that development, not on the highways themselves, but inside on lower speed access lanes with speeds about 10 to 15 miles an hour. And you can see the internal development here. That's one of the major access lanes that runs through the development. There's a pedestrian amenity that's been brought in, right? It's not super urban, right? But it's for a strip mall with a Bed Bath & Beyond and a grocery store, it's all right. But the beautiful thing is, I see these parking lots and I don't get upset, right? I see them as a land bank. You can infill that. At a future point in time, you've got clear-cut land already. And if you decide to urbanize, take advantage of that. Because you can take, even if you want the parking, you can put in structured parking later, infill that, and you've got something to save for later. So as a transition from suburban to urban, this is the kind of way to think, and it's a way that addresses the safety issue. Now, you're not going to get people safely across these arterials or conveniently across these arterials, but that's not their point. You've got it in the development. And if you need be, you can come back and retrofit the arterials too. Now, none of this I would propose to you is especially radical. It's what Europeans already do. Now, this is complicated because Germans like to do big metaphysical systems, right? But this is the Germany's equivalent of a functional classification system. And what we see is that speed limit corresponds to the intersect not just of roadway function, but to developmental characteristic. So arrayed at the top are the different types of developmental characteristics that you might encounter. You have mobility-oriented roadways without buildings. You have roadways that serve collector functions, and then roadways that provide access or pedestrian uses arrayed on the your perspective, far right of this chart. And then arrayed in the columns is the type of function of these roadways. Now, what's interesting about this is that unlike what we have, right, we have arterials and locals, but we don't have good intermediate roads, at least not how we're traditionally trained as engineers. They have them by default. But what's especially interesting is that the max in developed areas, the max speed they would design a roadway for, not the starting point, the cap, is 50 kilometers per hour, which is really 31 miles an hour, right? Which is where we start our arterials. And do you put these urban surface highways where there's development? No. That's dangerous, right? Those black boxes, right? That's telling you do not put them there. That is not a safe solution. That's a hazardous solution. It's discouraged. And it's discouraged in the interest of safety. Now, we have, increasingly, there's been a push. The ITE folks, the Congress for the New Urbanism folks have put out, it's got the worst title. They've changed it recently. But the working title has been Context-Sensitive Solutions in Designing Major Urban Thoroughfares for Walkable Communities, right? Long title. But what it provides is intermediate class roadways, which we have not had in our design palette traditionally, right? Having an avenue or a boulevard type treatment, Nato Parkway being a great example of that, or our commercial main streets. While they may be classified as arterials, and while they may carry arterial level traffic volumes, the correct design specifications for these roadways are not the same as your conventional suburban arterial. And what this does, it doesn't deviate from the Green Book. The Green Book's not bad, really. You dig through there and you can do almost anything reasonable with the design parameters included in the AASHTO Green Book. What it does is it takes those specifications and tells you when you should use the low end and when you should use the high end. Well, really, in this case, when you should use the low end, right? What developmental conditions are appropriate for the use of what ranges in there. So what it does is it fine-tunes the Green Book for designing in specific types of developmental contexts. And then finally, it's not enough to think in terms of streets. I said this before and I'll reiterate. We need to think in terms of networks and about the redistributive function of traffic associated with different configurations. And urban designers are actually already pretty good at that. And you guys that do traffic calming, you already get this because you already do this. It's just taking it to the next level and bringing the land use phase directly into it as well. So, concluding thoughts before I take questions. I want to make the case today that our urban traffic safety problem is as much a land use function as a traffic engineering problem. It may be fun to pick on us engineers, but we're not the bad guys, right? Pick on us for entertainment, but don't do it because we're the sole guilty party. There are plenty of people to pick on, and the land use planners deserve at least some of the blame. I too often hear this debate between pedestrians versus motorists, and I think that's an argument that's not worth fighting. What we should be fighting for are safer communities and roadways. Because the factors that cause a car to run into a pedestrian are oftentimes the same factors that cause that car to run into another car. And if we address the pre-crash conditions that result in that behavior, we can make things safer for everyone, right? And so what you've created is a win-win situation. And I think the urban design community and the planning community needs to begin reassessing their role in traffic safety. It may be easy to pawn this responsibility off to the traffic engineer, but it's an interdisciplinary problem and it requires an interdisciplinary solution, and one that land use planners and urban designers have an important role to contribute to and have made important roles in the past, and one that they need to reassert in the future. And with that, I will conclude. I will just bring to your note the article that a lot of this is called from. It was a feature article in the July edition of JAPA, which is nice for you because that means it's one of the free articles in JAPA. You can just download it. That's the URL if you care about that. And if you want to get in touch with me, that's my contact information down at Texas A&M. And with that, I will take questions.
And I'll remind people to use the microphone if you have one at your desk.
Yeah.
I wanted to notice that when we took our permaculture class, one of the things that we were looking at were how does a village naturally look. Mm-hmm. And they found that similar to the traffic circles, that a village naturally formed in some countries in Africa. They had pictures of these in overhead views in a circle, and they had little circles with little, I guess what you'd call local streets, you know, where the pedestrians would go, and then they'd have an urban center or a community center. And I witnessed this in Germany also. And my thought was, I live in Raleigh Hills, and it was planned, and I don't know if it's still planned. They were talking about doing something similar to basically a community center where everything is there, and you don't have to have the cars moving far away. You don't have to go to a job. And then you could bring in, you know, a lot of that, restrain it into a much smaller area and have more walking and less cars in the first place, which gets rid of all of this problem of cars, people, cars, and all of the design solutions. So I was just wondering if you could comment on, is that part of the thought that goes into design at all these days or not?
Well, I think a lot of the thought that a lot of our communities are built as for-profit development, and I work closely with our land development folks, and they refer to them as residential products. They're not neighborhoods. And they would laugh if they were here because I make fun of them for that. But there should be more thought in that. Now, in terms of how you design, what you're talking about are organic communities. And they actually will follow a couple forms, one being the concentric form that you suggested. Topography will shape it too, so you'll have riverine settlements. You may have hilltop settlements and the like. And they'll take different forms. But the pedestrian characteristics directed and govern the form that took. European communities have this, even the ones that were structurally planned. Rome did this all the time. Rome would actually superimpose it. Colonial settlements like grids because you don't have to be there to design them, right? You just draw squares. So early colonial settlements would follow that grid form. But they weren't designed for cars. The streets were narrower than we have today as a result. And you can certainly make that work, well, balance that out between cars and pedestrians. I don't know that I want to take the position that we ought to design all communities to serve solely pedestrians or principally pedestrians. Because at least now there's a market for automobile stuff. And the question then becomes, can we design things that accommodate all of these users in a safe form? And I would say, regardless of the users, I don't necessarily want to make the moralistic statement of this person is that person, but rather, can we create something that works well for all of us together, or at least doesn't cause us to kill one another, right? So, and certainly we can do that, and that requires paying attention to speed and design. But yeah, good point. Yeah.
Welcome to Portland. How do bicycles fit in your model, and how can it apply relative to that vehicle type? And also, given that we're more of not a city that's really building a lot of subdivisions, we're more of a built-out city. How does your model apply in really retrofitting a built-out city?
Well, I should start with saying that somebody from Texas coming to Portland and lecturing you guys on design is kind of like David Letterman coming here and lecturing you on the problems with inter-office romance, right? I mean, it's not we don't have a lot of biking in Texas. You'll get it in the college towns. You have some in Austin. You have some in College Station. There weren't very many bike crashes at all in our data set, and there aren't a lot of at least observed. We don't keep bike counts. There weren't a lot of observed bike crashes or bike volumes in San Antonio when we were there. Bikes are tricky, right? And I don't want to overstate what we know. And I was actually talking with Professor Dill earlier about this, and we don't know very much about bike safety at all. The studies aren't very good, and the ones that exist aren't especially compelling. And if you ask the bicycle community itself, do we do bike lanes, do we do on-street riding, how do we accommodate this, you're going to get a lot of substantive debate. And there's not a lot of evidence one way or the other on the best way to do that. I've got my opinion, right?
And I've got my evidence.
Yeah, you have hard data. I would love to see that. So, I mean, if you've got good data, I haven't seen any good data. So, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Well, you might want to look in lots of the European cities that have built bicycle transportation systems and compare their crash rates and mode share rates, and there's a lot of decades worth.
The problem is, though, from a methodological standpoint, it's called the ecological fallacy. And you can't take one scale. Well, you see good stuff. John Puka, for example, does great work that looks at, say, the Netherlands versus the United States in terms of bicycle modes to work. But you can't take that scale and then say, therefore, whatever sub-elements are associated with that culture are the cause. I mean, it could be, well, it could be the culture themselves. I mean, take the Netherlands, for example, that gets put up there. It could well be that folks in the Netherlands...
You don't want to apply that comment to your own study, though.
I'm not going to make any statement whatsoever on bike safety with this one because I don't think I have the evidence that would support it. And right now I'm simply saying from a methodological standpoint, it's hard to take national data and then say, therefore, these streets are better. I mean, you can't... It's a logical fallacy, which doesn't mean it's not right? It just means you can't make that logical step. The thing you would need, and you may well have this, and if you do, I would, in fact, if anybody has it, you guys have it, right? Exposure-adjusted crash rates for different facility types. I mean, I've been trying to get at this. Austin has at least preliminary data, and I've been trying to get at it there, and it's, all I've done is cause my graduate students a lot of grief and aggravation.
And I'll tell you, our crash rates are lower on our streets with bike lanes than our streets without bike lanes for bicycles.
Yeah, and that wouldn't surprise me. That'd be cool. Actually, we should talk offline because I guess we'll talk afterwards. Yeah, I'd love to get more on this. Cool. Yeah.
I know very little about transit in San Antonio, but can you speak something about that? And was there any intermodal conflict at all in your model?
Transit in San Antonio is exclusively bus service, and it's mixed traffic buses. I mean, there's not much of an elaborate transit system there to speak of. The data only gave us, and we've got more recent data, but the data we used for this analysis only gave us the severity of the type and not the specific individuals or the demographics of the driver. So I couldn't say if it was a bus running into a pedestrian or two cars or, we couldn't break it down to that fine level. All we could determine is where crashes of different severity occurred spatially. So I couldn't say that. Houston, on the other hand, if you want to cause those people trouble, ask them about transit crashes because their light rail is renowned for crashing into things. So, and if you guys do your surface light rail, you guys do it okay. I guess Seattle's been having trouble with that too. We were talking about that earlier. But Houston's a good place to look to find out about that. And you'll make them uncomfortable. Yeah.
I'm curious.
Okay.
I'm curious that as you slow down the traffic on the arterials by putting in trees or redesigning them, are people just going to have to get used to traveling slower and taking longer to get where they need to go, or are you planning on having the employment locations changing to kind of change the whole way of travel? I'm just wondering if it's just going to make more people jam up the freeways that are in existence, or make more freeways need to be built to get to the same distances in the same kind of period of time.
There are a couple components to that problem. One that I don't deal with directly, but that would be a great place to start, is with the issue of travel behavior themselves and how people determine not just location but route choice. I mean, we saw with the Minneapolis bridge collapse a couple of years back, it was studied what would happen. You would expect the parallel bridges to be saturated with traffic because that major artery into the city was gone. And it didn't happen. Now, where did those people go? I mean, it's not what I studied, but they went somewhere. Or maybe they didn't go anywhere. But something behaviorally shifted. And the induced demand work and the travel behavior work would be a way to go at that. The other counterpoint, a lot of times with the behavior stuff, we sort of look at what happens with small degrees of variation and land use. But that said, when you have huge gradation, I mean, you never see a city like New York collapse because it doesn't have that excess capacity. And I'm not saying that one way or another that's what we should or shouldn't do, but that there's a behavioral element of that that needs to be accounted for that's not, it doesn't get touched in this study. I simply want to make the point on whether or not something is or is not more or less safe, and then whether somebody wants to make the normative case of what we ought to do in terms of traffic or in terms of developmental function. Again, I have my own opinions on that. And this would be an offline type of thing. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you.
So before
Oh.
we thank you, though, I need to thank everyone for coming and also put a plug in for next week's speaker. Joe Courtwright, economist with Impressa Inc., will be talking about the economic value of walkability. So maybe a good follow-up to what you're talking about here. Thank you very much, Eric, for coming out and joining us.
Thank you.